30 meters tall, 27 tons of pure gold just on the interior walls, bronze columns of 8 meters, weighing 34 tons each, entire walls lined with cedar imported from Lebanon, polished cypress floors, giant cherubim of 4.5 meters covered in gold leaf. Solomon's temple was not just a religious building, it was the most expensive, most grandiose and technically most advanced construction in the ancient world. It took 7 years to be ready. It consumed more gold than any other known structure of the time. And here is the detail that no one can explain. The foundation stones weighed up to 400 tons, without cranes, without metal pulleys, without proper wheels. How blocks of that size were cut, transported and fitted together with millimeter precision 3,000 years ago. Modern engineers look at the numbers and are left without an answer. Because it was not just grandiose, it was impossible. In this video, you will discover the techniques, the materials, and the secrets behind the most impressive work of antiquity. And at the end, you will understand why to this day no one has managed to replicate what Solomon built. The first problem was simple to understand, but brutal to solve. To create the foundation of the temple, Solomon did not want ordinary stones. He wanted the largest stones ever cut in Israel. 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 17 uses a specific expression, great stones and costly stones. Archaeologists who studied the platform of the Second Temple, built afterward on the same site, found blocks of more than 400 tons. 400 tons is the weight of 60 adult elephants. Now imagine cutting that from a mountain without dynamite, without electric saws, without anything modern. 80,000 men were assigned solely to that task, cutting stones. They worked in quarries scattered across the mountains around Jerusalem. They woke before the sun rose, walked to the extraction areas, and began the most dangerous work on the project. Because you do not simply strike the rock until it breaks. Not when you need precision, not when each block needs to fit perfectly in the temple, and especially not when there is a rule that changes everything. No sound of an iron tool could be heard at the construction site. This is in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7. It meant that the stones had to leave the quarries already finished. Every cut, every angle, every surface, everything done far from the temple. The technique used was ancient but brilliant. First, the cutters identified where they wanted to split the rock, scored lines, using stones harder than limestone. Then they opened small, deep holes along those lines, inserted dry wooden wedges, and then poured water. The wood absorbed the water and swelled. The pressure increased, and after hours, sometimes days, the rock split exactly where they had planned, without explosives, without the noise of hammers striking metal chisels. Just the dull sound of stone splitting. But cutting was only the first part. Each block needed to be shaped, smoothed, measured. This required another type of worker. Experienced men who knew how to read the architect's marks, because there were no detailed drawings on paper. The instructions came carved into the stones themselves, symbols indicating where that specific block would be placed in the temple. If a mistake was made, the block was useless. 400 tons of stone became rubble. The work in the quarries was not just difficult, it was deadly. Collapses happened. Poorly calculated blocks rolled down the mountainside, crushing whoever was in the way. There was no safety equipment. There were no nearby hospitals. If you were badly injured, your chances of survival were minimal. And even so, 80,000 men woke every day and went back to those mountains. Why? Because for the Israelites the rotation system was paid labor, with the right to return home. For the Canaanites under forced labor, there was no choice. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 21 says that Solomon subjected them to forced labor that lasts to this day. They cut stones or faced punishment. But cutting the stone was only the beginning of the problem, Because next came the part that killed more people than anything else. How do you move 400 tons of stone across kilometers of mountain without machines? And why did so many men die trying? Imagine the scene. A rope snaps under pressure. The stone suddenly stops, men in front fall. Others are trapped beneath the block, with no chance of escape. Accidents like this were not rare, they were part of the brutal routine of this work. Because the second challenge was worse than the first. You have already cut the stone. It is ready, perfectly shaped. Now you need to bring it to Jerusalem and it weighs 400 tons. How do you move that? 70,000 men were assigned exclusively to hauling. They did not cut, did not build, only transported. And the technique they used seemed simple on paper, but was hellish in practice. Earth ramps. They built gigantic compacted earth ramps rising and falling over the mountains. The stone was placed on thick tree trunks that acted as rollers. Ropes of plant fiber, as thick as human arms, were tied around the block. And then began the most brutal work of the project, pulling. Hundreds of men gripped the ropes. A supervisor shouted rhythmic commands so that everyone pulled at the same time. Pull, stop, reposition the trunks left behind, pull again. The stone moved centimeters, sometimes only a few fingers' width at a time. A block of 400 tons could take weeks to travel 5 km. And during all that time, the men slept beside the stone, ate there, did not let go until it reached its destination. But here is the detail that makes everything worse. The ropes were not eternal. Plant fibers hold weight but have a limit. Under constant pressure, they began to fray. Strands snapped one by one. And when the rope finally gave way, it was not just the rope that went. The weight redistributed violently. Men were hurled forward, others were trapped. The stone, without control, sometimes slid backward, crushing whoever was in the way. There was no insurance, no compensation for the family. You died and another man took your place on the rope. The next day, the Israelites working in rotations had an advantage. 1 month pulling stones, 2 months at home. They endured because they knew it would end. But the Canaanites under forced labor had no such hope. They pulled until the work was finished. 7 years. Some did not survive the first few months. Exhaustion, injuries, illnesses caused by sleeping in the open. Mortality among the haulers was the highest of the entire project. And even so, the work never stopped, because Solomon had deadlines to meet. Now comes the impressive part. When the stone finally arrived at the construction site in Jerusalem, it could not be touched. Remember the rule: no sound of an iron tool. This meant that the positioning had to be perfect. If the stone was even a finger out of place, you could not hammer it to adjust. You would have to pull it back, reposition the rollers, try again. That is why the supervisors were merciless. They measured everything, checked every angle, and if something was wrong, the blame fell on the haulers. Punishments were severe: floggings, reduced rations, sometimes worse. But transporting giant stones was not the only impossible problem. 200 km separated Jerusalem from the forests of Lebanon, and Solomon needed thousands of cedar logs. How do you bring timber from another country without trucks? And how many men died on the way? The problem was not just the distance, it was what the distance meant. 200 km separated Jerusalem from the cedar forests in Lebanon. 200 km of mountains, valleys, rivers, and foreign territory. And Solomon needed thousands of logs. Cedar was the most noble wood of the ancient world, resistant, aromatic, nearly indestructible, used by kings to build palaces and temples, but it grew only in the Lebanese mountains. Israel had none. So Solomon did what any leader would do: he bought it. The negotiation with Hiram, king of Tyre, is recorded in 1 Kings, chapter 5, verses 6 to 11. Hiram would provide the specialized lumberjacks and all the cedar needed. In return, Israel would pay 20,000 cores of wheat per year. That is equivalent to more than 4 million liters and another 20,000 baths of olive oil, another 2 million liters. It was an absurdly expensive trade deal, but Solomon had no choice. Without cedar there was no temple. 10,000 Israelites were assigned to work in Lebanon, but they did not stay there all the time. 1 Kings, chapter 5, verse 14, explains the system. 1 month in Lebanon, 2 months at home. Adoniram was the supervisor responsible for organizing the rotations. Every month 10,000 men climbed into the Lebanese mountains. They worked alongside the Sidonian lumberjacks, who were specialists, felling gigantic cedars centuries old. Then they cut the trunks into transportable sizes. And then came the most complicated part, getting it to Israel. The transport was divided into 2 stages. First stage by sea. The logs were tied to one another, forming enormous rafts, pushed and guided by smaller boats. These rafts floated along the Mediterranean Sea to the port of Joppa, which today is part of Tel Aviv. The journey took days, storms were common, sometimes the ropes broke and logs were lost at sea, but it was the fastest way to move heavy timber over long distances. Second stage, by land. From Joppa to Jerusalem is about 60 km. That sounds like little, but each cedar log weighed tons. They used the same technique as with the stones. Smaller logs as rollers, ropes, hundreds of men pulling. The difference is that wood is more fragile than stone. If you let the cedar drag along the ground, it would scratch, crack, lose its quality. So the care required was doubled and the time much greater. A single log could take weeks to arrive. The men doing this work slept in the open, ate basic rations of bread, lentils, and water. Many fell ill with fevers, infections, exhaustion. There were no specialist physicians. If you became too sick to work, you were replaced. And if you died, your family received the news weeks later, when your rotation ended and you did not come home. It was a brutal system, but efficient, because in the end the cedar arrived and every log that entered Jerusalem was one more piece of the most ambitious puzzle ever assembled. But bringing stones and timber was only half the challenge, because there was a rule that made everything 10 times harder, a rule no one could break, and if they did, punishment was immediate and severe. How do you build in absolute silence? Think about what would happen if a worker accidentally struck a hammer against stone. The sound would echo across the site. Supervisors would come running. No excuse would matter. Punishment would be immediate and severe, because there was a rule above all others. A rule that made the construction of the temple unlike any project ever undertaken. No sound of an iron tool could be heard at the site. None. This was not a suggestion, not a preference. It was a direct order recorded in 1 Kings, chapter 6, verse 7. And whoever broke that rule paid dearly. But here is the question that no one easily answers. How do you build a structure 30 meters tall with blocks of hundreds of tons, using giant cedar beams without making noise? How do you fit stone to stone without adjusting? How do you correct an error without hammering? The answer lay in preparation. Everything had to leave the quarries and carpentry workshops in perfect condition. Every stone cut to the exact size. Every cedar beam measured to the millimeter. Every joint planned in advance. Because when the material arrived at Mount Moriah, where the temple was being raised, there would be no second chances. The architects and master builders used a marking system. Symbols were carved into the stones, back at the quarries, Hebrew letters, numbers, signs indicating the exact position of each block. When the stone arrived in Jerusalem, the builders read the marks and knew where to place it. No remeasuring, no adjusting with chisels, just placing it. And if it did not fit, then the error was back there at the quarries and someone would be punished for it. The work at the site was tense, silent. Hundreds of men moving enormous stones, unable to speak loudly, unable to use metal tools. They used wooden levers, wedges, ropes, slow and calculated movements. One block out of place meant dismantling part of the structure and starting over. And all of this without hammering, without sawing, without striking. The level of coordination required was staggering. One miscommunication and tons of stone could fall on workers. But why did this rule exist? The answer lies in the temple's purpose. It was not an ordinary palace. It was the house of God, a sacred place where the Creator himself would dwell. And God had ordered that the site be treated with absolute reverence from the very first day of construction. The sound of iron tools was considered profane. So the work had to be carried out in holiness, in silence, as if every stone placed was an act of worship. The 3,300 supervisors had the task of ensuring this. They circulated constantly, watched every movement, listened for every sound, and at the slightest sign of disobedience they acted. Punishments varied: floggings for minor infractions, reduced rations, even heavier work, and in extreme cases expulsion from the project. For the Canaanites under forced labor, expulsion could mean imprisonment or worse. For the Israelites on rotation, it meant public disgrace. So everyone obeyed, worked in silence. And somehow, against all odds, the temple rose stone by stone, without sound, without error. But building in silence was only part of the challenge, because the temple could not merely be large, it had to shine. 27 tons of pure gold covering entire walls. How do you work with that quantity of precious metal? And who was the man Solomon brought from another country to do it? The heat was unbearable. Furnaces burned day and night melting gold. Sweat-soaked men hammered thin sheets over wooden molds. Others polished surfaces until they shone like mirrors. And at the center of it all, a man named Huram observed every detail. He was not an Israelite. He was Phoenician from Tyre, just like the cedar, contracted personally by Solomon, because no one in Israel mastered metalwork as he did. 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Huram was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was from Tyre, a craftsman in bronze. He was filled with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge to carry out all work in bronze. But bronze was not the greatest challenge. It was the gold, 27 tons of it. 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 20 to 22, describes how the interior of the temple was covered. The oracle, the Holy of Holies, measured 9 meters long, 9 wide and 9 high. Everything there was covered in pure gold: the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Not paint, not thin gilding. These were beaten gold plates fastened over cedar. And the work of preparing those plates was grueling. Pure gold is soft, malleable. You can hammer it until it is as thin as paper without it cracking, but this demands technique. Specialist craftsmen heated small amounts of gold until soft. Then they hammered them over stone anvils, struck, turned, struck again until they achieved uniform thin sheets. Each plate took hours to make and thousands were needed to cover all the surfaces of the temple. The work never stopped. Furnaces ran without pause. Firewood was burned in staggering quantities to maintain the necessary heat. Men worked in shifts because no one could endure more than a few hours near the fire. Sweat poured off them. Their hands burned even through the thick rags used to hold the tools. And the gold came from tribute, from mines controlled by Solomon, from gifts sent by foreign kings. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 14, says that Solomon received 660 talents of gold per year. That is equivalent to more than 22 tons annually. Much of that went directly into the temple. But gold did not cover only walls. There were objects, giant cherubim of wood covered in gold, each 4.5 meters tall, wings spread touching the walls of the Holy of Holies. The incense altar made entirely of gold, tables, utensils. Chains, everything gleamed. and crafting those pieces required another level of skill entirely. Sculptors shaped the wood. Then the metalworkers applied the gold, hammering thin sheets over the carved forms, polishing until there were no imperfections. It was art and engineering at the same time. Huram supervised everything personally. He was not just a worker, he was the master, the outside specialist brought in because Israel had no one of equal ability. And he delivered the bronze columns called jachin and bows, each 8 meters tall, the great bronze basin for purification, supported by 12 bronze oxen, all of it made under his direction. And when they finished, when the last gold plate was fixed, when the last object was polished, the temple was no longer merely a construction. It was a wonder that reflected light as no other structure on earth. But not all the gold, all the timber, and all the stones meant anything without one thing: coordination. How do you organize 150,000 workers spread across different locations doing different tasks? And how do you ensure everything is ready in exactly 7 years without delay? 7 years, 255 days. That was the deadline. No extensions, no negotiation. Solomon had promised God that the temple would be finished in the 11th year of his reign. And if you think coordinating 5 people is hard, try imagining 150,000. Workers spread across quarries, forests in Lebanon, metalworking workshops, and the central construction site in Jerusalem, each group doing a different task, each task depending on another. A delay at any point stalls everything. How do you guarantee this does not become total chaos? The answer lay in the supervisors, 3,300 of them. 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 16 records the exact number. These men did not carry stones, did not cut cedar, did not hammer gold. They organized, inspected, ensured every worker was in the right place, doing the right task at the right moment. And above them were 550 chief officers. 2 Kings chapter 9 verse 23, these commanded the entire project. They reported directly to Solomon, and the pressure on them was immense. The system operated like a military machine. Each supervisor controlled around 45 workers. They knew every man by name. They knew who was good at what, who was reliable, who needed constant watching. Every morning before sunrise, the supervisors gathered their groups, distributed the day's tasks, explained what needed to be done, and then monitored until sundown. If someone was absent, they were replaced immediately. If someone worked too slowly, they received a warning. On the third warning came punishment, but it was not only about punishment. The system had rewards. Israelites who completed their 1-month rotations received payment in wheat, oil, and wine, enough to sustain the family during the 2 months at home. Some supervisors offered extra portions to teams that finished ahead of schedule. This created healthy competition. Groups wanted to be the best, worked with greater effort, and the project advanced. Now comes the detail that truly impresses. In the 7 years of construction, no major disaster halted the project. There was no worker revolt. No war diverted resources. No plague killed thousands. The work continued. Stone after stone, beam after beam, gold plate after gold plate. And in the 8th month of Solomon's 11th year, exactly as planned, the final piece was set in place. The temple was complete. The inauguration took place months later during the Feast of Tabernacles. 1 Kings chapter 8 describes the scene. All Israel gathered. Priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies. Solomon prayed publicly, asking God to dwell there. And then something happened that no one anticipated. A cloud filled the temple. Not ordinary mist, it was the glory of God, so dense, so intense, that the priests could not stand. 1 Kings chapter 8 verses 10 and 11 says that they could not continue to minister because of the cloud, because the glory of the Lord filled his house. 150,000 men had worked toward that moment. Many had died in the quarries, crushed by blocks. Others died pulling ropes that snapped. Some succumbed to the heat of the smelting furnaces. But those who survived stood there seeing with their own eyes that the place they had built with their hands now sheltered the presence of God Himself. And Solomon celebrated by sacrificing 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. 1 Kings, chapter 8, verse 63. Numbers that conveyed the magnitude of what had just been accomplished. The most impossible construction project of antiquity, complete. Now watch the video about how Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Solomon's temple. Click on the video on screen and discover how that terrible story unfolded. Click now.